So I set off to gather more information on peak oil and went to speak with James Kunstler, author, social critic, and post-peak oil visionary. He talked to me about what he sees in the future for the airline industry, the recent Brazilian oil field discovery, and our oil dependency on other nations. What kind of time frame?
Oh, for me, a lot of people are saying, we've got until 2027. Everything will be cool. We'll have all these rescue remedies. We'll be running our cars on, mentholated cow shit and air and, all this stuff. Forget about it. Right. I think we're going to be in really serious shit in probably 5 years.
Right.
And I think we're going to start seeing things that will be pretty upsetting and disturbing inside of 36 months, a couple of years, in a few years. The airline industry, as we've known, it's not going to exist. You're not going to fly off to Louisville to see Granny. Right. If you want to get there, you'll have to get there some other way.
She's going to have to get on her wagon and come see me.
Yeah, or her mule. On the menu that we haven't seen yet are oil shortages and gasoline shortages. That really hasn't occurred except for the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, and that was an obvious supply problem from the Gulf of Mexico. Mm-hmm. But it's looking more and more like we're getting pretty close to having supply problems with gasoline, and part of that is because we're getting a really considerable amount of gasoline now from in the form of imports. Mm-hmm. We're not making enough to we're not refining enough for our own use, and the Europeans are using much more diesel, and they have more gasoline than they can use, so they're sending us the gasoline, but things can happen, and they could get into trouble. The basic thing being that's yet another thing that we're dependent on foreign nations to supply us with, and it's just not a healthy thing.
I hear a lot of people say, don't worry about it, you've got Brazil.
They don't really know how much oil is under there. They're basically just wild-ass guesses. And, I guess for the most recent Brazilian discovery, they said, 10 billion barrels. We don't really know. What we do know is these are very, very deep oil fields.
10 billion barrels total?
That's the figure that I thought I heard for the latest Brazilian discovery.
Okay.
And by the way, the U.S. uses 7 billion barrels a year, and the world uses about 30. So 10 billion, if you do the math, you don't have to go past third grade math to figure that out. But, let's remember, these oil fields in the Atlantic Ocean, they're deep water fields. If it's anything like the Chevron Jack discovery, the famous discovery from, I guess, 2 years ago, which was announced with great fanfare. The Chevron Jack in deep water in the Gulf of Mexico was a mile underwater and then about 5 miles underground underwater. Just the amount of steel that you need to get down there is unbelievable. So they have no idea. This is like 2 years later. They still have no idea what they're going to produce, if anything, out of Jack. I think you're going to see a similar thing with Brazil, that it's going to be hugely expensive. Whatever amount that they estimate as a reserve, they're only going to get a fraction of it out. And there are going to be all kinds of problems. There's an additional layer of problems with the lack of good working oil drilling technology. The world is really hurting for oil rigs. A lot of the equipment for drilling and production out there is very old, and one of the big complaints is that it's so old and it's in dire need of being replaced, and it would cost something on the order of $1 trillion in investment to replace the current infrastructure for the oil industry. And one of the big problems with that is that you're talking about something that can be described as a sunset industry. They can see the sun setting on their industry. They're not going to take $1 trillion and invest it in something that has no future. They're going to, whatever profits they're making now, they're going to pay their executives big bonuses and pay their shareholders and buy back their own stock to jack up their stock value and do all the other things that companies do when they're not particularly interested in the future. And then we'll be faced with the necessity to do what I've been saying, which is the necessity to make other arrangements for things like how we occupy the landscape, and how we move about the landscape, and how we produce our food, and how we stay warm, and you know, where we go when we're not home, and how we do trade and manufacturing. And it's just probably going to be very different from, you know, from the George Jetson world that we grew up in.